my name is Maria Paula.
Hi, my name is Jasmine, and we're going to be discussing chapter 35 and 36.
First, we're going to be talking about chapter 35, but before we start talking about the chapter, we should go over some key terms and some vocab. So first, we have labor-intensive goods. Those are a product requiring a relatively large amount of labor to be produced. Then we have land-intensive goods, which require a large amount of land. And then capital-intensive goods, which require a product that uses a relatively large amount of capital. Next, we have the opportunity cost ratio. That's an equivalency showing the number of units of two products that can be produced with the same resources. This is an example. And then there's the principle of comparative advantage. That's the total output that will be used greatest when each good is produced by the nation that has the lowest domestic opportunity cost for that good. Then there's the term of trade. The rate at which units of one product can be exchanged for units of another product. The price of a good or service. The amount of one good or service that must be given up to obtain one unit of another good or service. Then we have the trading possibilities line. A line that shows the different combinations of two products that an economy is able to obtain when it is specialized in the production of one product and trades to obtain the other product. Then there's gains from trade. The extra output that trading partners obtain through the specialization of production and exchange of goods and services. Then there's world price, the international market price of one good or service determined by the world demand and the supply. Then lastly, there's domestic price, the price of a good or service within a country determined by domestic demand and supply. Next, we have the export supply curve, an upward sloping curve that shows the amount of a product that domestic firms will export at each world price that is above the domestic price. Then in contrast, we have the import demand curve, a downsloping curve showing the amount of a product that an economy will import at each world price below the domestic price. Then there's the equilibrium world price, the price that equates the quantity supplied and the demand globally. Then there's tariffs, a tax imposed by a nation on an imported good. Then there's two types of tariffs. Revenue tariffs are tariffs designed to produce income for federal government. Protective tariff is a tariff designed to shield domestic producers of a good or service from the competition of foreign producers. Then there's the import quota, a limit imposed by a nation on the quantity of a good that may be imported during some period of time. Then there's the non-tariff barrier. All barriers other than protective tariffs that nations erect to impede international trade, including import quotas, licensing requirements, unreasonable product quality standards, then unnecessary bureaucratic details and custom procedures, and so on. Then there's the voluntary export restrictions, a trade barrier by which foreign firms voluntarily limit the amount of their exports to a particular country. Then there's the strategic trade policy. These are trade barriers to reduce the risk inherent in product development by domestic firms, particularly that involving advanced technology. And then there's dumping. That's the sale of a product in a foreign country at prices either below cost or below the prices commonly charged at home. Then there's the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Legislation passed this act in 1930 and it established very high tariffs. Its objective was to reduce imports and stimulate the domestic economy, but it resulted only in retaliatory tariffs by other nations. There's also the Trade Adjustment Assistance Act, a U.S. law passed in 2002 that provides cash assistance, education training benefits, healthcare subsidies, and wage subsidized to workers displaced by imports or relocations of U.S. plants to other countries. Lastly, there's offshoring. This is the practice of shifting work previously done by American workers to workers located abroad. Then there's the World Trade Organization. That's an organization of 149 nations that oversees the provisions of the current World Trade Agreement. It resolves trade disputes stemming from it and holds forums for further rounds of trade negotiations. Then there's the Doha Round, a sequence of trade negotiations by members of the World Trade Organization named after Doha, Qatar, where the set of negotiations began. Now that we know the vocab, let's talk about the first section of chapter 35. So the first part of chapter 35 talks about comparative advantage between two countries. So for example, if I were a country and Jasmine's a country, let's say that I can produce 2 apples with 1 hour of work and 3 oranges with 1 hour of work. Then let's say that Jasmine can produce 3 apples with 1 hour of work and 2 oranges with 1 hour of work. So here's where we have the comparative advantage. For example, Jasmine can make more apples than me in 1 hour of work, so that means she has the comparative advantage for apples. But I can make more oranges in 1 hour of work than she can, so I have the comparative advantage. So this is where specialization comes in. we specialize our work into one product and then trade for the other product. So I would specifically make oranges, Jasmine would specifically make apples, and we would trade with each other to get the comparative advantage for the products. And then international trade enables nations to specialize, increase productivity, and increase output available for consumption.
Alright, so now that Marie Paul is done talking about the first section of chapter 35 and the vocabulary, I will now be talking about sections 2 and 3 of this chapter and start off with section 2. So let's say that the world price for bananas in country Marie Paula is $1, and in country Jasmine, the bananas cost 50 cents. Country Jasmine would want to export bananas so that they could make $1 off each banana compared to the 50 cents that they would make if they sold it domestically. In a two-country world model, equilibrium world prices and equilibrium quantities of exports and imports occur where one nation export supply curve intersects the other nation's import demand curve. Okay, so now we are on our last section of chapter 35, and as we stated earlier in section 1, Marie Paula's country had a comparative advantage of oranges, whereas I had a comparative advantage of apples. And let's say that Marie Paula's country places a tariff on her oranges. That would make my country have to spend more money on those oranges. And the reason why her country would place a tariff on oranges is to increase its price, reduce its consumption, increase its domestic production, reduce its imports, and generate tariff revenue for her government. And a tariff is similar to an import quota, which does the exact same, except a quota generates revenue for foreign producers rather than for most government imposing the quota. And most rationales for trade protections are special interest requests that, if followed, would create gains for protected industries and their workers at the expense of greater losses for the economy. And in 2002, there was an act created that was called the Trade Adjustment Assistance Act of 2002. And it was designed to help some of the workers hurt by shifts like these in international trade patterns. However, a burden that American workers had to face was offshoring, in which the Americans who lost their jobs, but not necessarily negative for the overall American economy. Moving on, we'll be now talking about chapter 36, which is called Exchange Rates, the Balance of Payment, and Trade Deficits. We are now going to be talking about the vocabulary first, and here are the vocab words. The first word is balance of payments, which is the sum of all the transactions that take place between its residents and the residents of all foreign nations. The vocab word current account is the section in a nation's international balance of payments that records exports and imports of goods and services, its net investment income, and its net transfers. Next is balance on goods and services. The exports of goods and services of a nation less its importance of goods and services in a year. Trade deficit is the amount by which a nation's imports of goods or goods and services exceed its imports of goods or goods and services. Trade surplus is the amount by which the nation's exports of goods exceed its imports of goods. Next is balance on current account, which is the exports of goods and services of a nation less its imports of goods and services plus its net investment income and net transfers in a year. Capital and financial account is the section of a nation's international balance of payments that records 1. The debt forgiveness by and to foreigners, and 2. Foreign purchases of assets in the United States and U.S. purchases of assets abroad. Balance on capital and financial account is the sum of the deficit on the capital account and the surplus on the financial account. Then is balance of payments, deficits, and surpluses. A balance of payments deficit occurs when a nation must draw down its official reserves to balance the capital and financial account with the current account. A balance of payments plus surplus occurs when a nation adds to its official reserves in order to balance the two accounts. Official reserves are foreign currencies owned by the central bank of a nation. Flexible or floating exchange rate systems is a system in which the demand and supply determine exchange rates and in which no government intervention occurs. Fixed exchange rate system, though, is a rate of exchange that is set in some way and therefore prevented from rising or falling with changes in currency supply and demand. The purchasing power parity theory is the idea that the exchange rate between nations equates to the purchasing power of various currencies. Exchange rates between two nations adjust to reflect the price level differences between the countries. The next word is currency interventions. And this is a government's giving and selling of its own currency or foreign currencies to alter international exchange rates. Exchange controls is the control a government may exercise over the quantity of foreign currency demand by its citizens and firms over the rates of exchange in order to limit its outpayments to its in-payment. The gold standard is a historical system of fixed exchange rate in which nations decline their currencies in terms of gold, maintain a fixed relationship between their stocks of gold and their money supplies, and allow the gold to be freely exported and imported. Devaluation is a decrease in the governmentally defined value of currency. The Bretton Woods system is an international monetary system developed after the Second World War in which adjustable pegs were employed. The International Monetary Fund helped stabilize foreign exchange rates, and gold and the dollar were used as international monetary reserves. The International Monetary Fund, abbreviated IMF, is the International Association of Nations that was formed after the Second World War to make loans of foreign monies to nations with temporary payments deficits until the early 1970s to administer the adjustable pegs. It now mainly makes loans to nations facing possible defaults on private and government loans. The last vocabulary word is managed floating exchange rates, and this is an exchange rate that is allowed to change or float as a result of change in currency supply and demand, but at times is altered or managed by governments via buying and selling of particular currencies. Now that we're done talking about the vocabulary, we're now going to move on to chapter 36.1. In this section, it talks about when there's U.S. export goods, that means it increases the demand for the dollar so people can buy the goods. Also, the capital and financial account balance includes the nation's debt forgiveness plus the financial assets that it sells to promote living abroad minus the financial assets from foreigners, and the sum of the current account balance and capital financial account balance equals 0. During a current account, a nation must draw down its official reserves to balance the capital and financial account, which leads to a balance of payments deficit, whereas a balance of payments surplus happens when a nation adds to its official reserves to balance the capital and financial accounts.
So now we're going to talk about chapter 36.2. In this chapter, we talked about how, in a system where exchange rates are flexible, the rates are determined by the demand for and supply of individual national currencies in a foreign exchange market. These determinants include changes in taste, relative national incomes, relative price levels, real interest rates, and speculation. Nations then set their exchange rates and maintain them by selling or buying reserves of currencies, establishing trade barriers, employing exchange controls, or incurring inflation or recession. So now we're going to be going over 36.3. In this chapter, or in this section of the chapter, we talked about how nations fixed exchange rates by valuing their currencies in terms of gold, tying their stocks of money to gold, and by allowing gold to flow between nations when balance of payments deficits and surplus occur. And then under the Bretton Woods exchange rate system, the exchange rate became fixed, but they also allowed for adjustments under special circumstances. The managed floating system of exchange relies on foreign exchange markets to establish equilibrium exchange rates. It also allows nations to buy and sell former currencies to stabilize short-term changes in the exchange rate or to correct negative exchange rate imbalances. So in conclusion, countries just want to trade and make money in the easiest way possible. So by trading, they make currencies that can be exchanged with each other and they have good exchange rates. And then they're able to trade with each other and make sure they get the best deals by doing specialization with each other and making sure they get the lowest prices with the best labor.
The end.